My content is for 13 and up, or adult collectors of the product. Hello everyone and welcome to BeyHistory, the series where we take a look at Beyblade, see their competitive history, see if there's anything cool about them, and talk about it. For this episode, we're going to be talking about Xcalibur. No, wait, we're not there yet. There we go. From Arthurian legend, the legendary sword wielded by King Arthur, Xcalibur. The lore of Xcalibur is just based on the idea that the sword was lodged in a stone, where only the King of Britain would be able to pull it out. It's a legendary weapon that only a worthy hero could wield. So yeah, it is pretty cool to base your Beyblade off of that and just have it be like this cool sharp sword contact point. I love this Beyblade. In the animation and in the manga, it is shared by multiple owners. The main owner is Alexander Xander Shakadera, or Xander, or by his other nickname. From all the Excaliburs except for Buster, when you get to Buster, the owner is changed to Jean, or Xavier Bogard. During season 1 of Beyblade Burst, he starts off with Xeno Excalibur, while in the manga he starts off with the single layer Excalibur, and during his encounter with Volt, not only does he shatter the original Valkyrie, but he also shatters his sword, which makes him have to eventually evolve his Bey to Xeno Excalibur. During Beyblade Burst God, after some off-screen adventures, his Xeno eventually will evolve into Sieg, and in a later attempt to test his power, he participates in a 100-blader challenge where he breaks his sword launcher and has to upgrade to the digital sword launcher. In Shozetsu, Xander helps assist Jean/Xavier in the birth of Buster Excalibur. Regardless, he does participate in helping him in his journey with wielding the powerful Excalibur Beyblade. And there's technically Xiphoid with Quad Strike, but no. This is a single layer Beyblade. This is the layer of the Beyblade that makes the main contact against opposing Beyblades. It holds teeth where it makes lock clicks in order for it to eventually burst. Your main part is your disc where it has metal weighting on it, and your driver/performance tip. With your dual layer, nothing really gets changed other than the fact that now this is a two-piece layer. You have your God layer system. Big difference here is that now the layers are a little bit different. They have God chips, which is this middle piece right here, more focused around gimmicks than the previous layers. The tip stays the same as well. The disc is now a little bit different. Now it can take plastic frame inserts in order to change its performance. You have the Chozy layer system, which the only thing that changes is the layers. This time a bigger focus on metal and no more God chips. Also, all the layers have a little hole in them. This is to add a level chip. Level chip gives balance to the designs and is a plastic insert. You then after have your Dynamite Battle/Burst Ultimate system. You have your DB core, which is the main part that holds the Beyblade together. Holds all the teeth here. Your blade is where it makes the opposing contact to other Beyblades. Your armor is your metal weighting that can either go above or below. Will be explained in a second. You have your BU disc or DB disc. These have a different gap to work specifically with these Beyblades, but are compatible with all of them. Tip is the same. When the armor is placed below, it has a low center of gravity. The disc gap is normal, and it only works with DB/BU discs in low mode. In high mode, the metal armor goes above and you have a high center of gravity. The disc gap is this time wider, but now it is compatible with any disc because the armor is not blocking it out. Released December 26, 2015, Excalibur Force Extreme was released. Starting us off with our original Excalibur, 8.07, 19.28, 5.28, 5.47, 5.17, 7.45, 32.63. This layer has some strong, tight locks, which is very, very important in the context of the original single/dual layers, simply for the fact that some had weaker teeth than others. The fact that this thing had strong teeth already made it comparable to most attack types, because since this is before all the tighter drivers that will lock your Beyblade together, having a tight attack type is ideal because you don't want to be bursting. Sometimes the teeth could skip with some massive impact to it. The main contact point is obviously the sword. It is a sharp contact point where it can lay some explosive attack, where it is a mix of burst attack and KO attack. This was a top attacker during its time of the single/dual layer era, being right up there next to the original Valkyrie, Victory Valkyrie. Now some issues are that the flower pattern could potentially kind of break because of its design. So sometimes when you're trying to do that pattern, sometimes you may just lose it. The best set of combinations to use would be Xcalibur on either Gravity, Knuckle, Heavy, Extreme. Xcalibur, Knuckle, Extreme, Kerbeus, Heavy Defense. So with Xcalibur, it has very powerful KO attack and burst attack. It'll just kill things, dude. It does such a good job. It can screw up its pattern, and then after it'll deplete in stamina near the end, and you can't lose via OS, so that is a big weakness. But more or less does the job, and I love it, dude. Then after, against a way more powerful combination like Death Scyther Heavy Defense, this is where it can struggle quite a bit because it is very tanky against the Xcalibur. So there are some things in the original single layer / dual layer stuff that can probably be annoying to this. I guess also Dark Death Scyther would also count, but more or less it can still kind of get the job done and be offensive enough to kind of win. Now we're gonna get an example of a unique setup with Spread Orbit. Acid Anubis, Yell Orbit. So we can see in the example here with Xcalibur, it'd be kind of like this idea of like stationary attack. So you basically have like this very aggressive layer that could potentially either KO the opponent, burst it, or maybe outlast it. And then the example with Anubis, you can kind of see it manage to pull it off and kind of do an alright job. And because of its strong teeth, it did not suffer as bad as some other single layer teeth for teeth wear, and it pretty much only died off once you got to Beyblade Burst God. So basically like 2 years of relevancy is pretty strong. Another thing to mention, other than the fact that it has burst and KO attack, is that with single layer Xcalibur, you can actually do kind of like a critical attack, which is essentially where there are times when you can just land a very strong hit at the end or potentially KO, even at like low RPM spin. So basically, you could get lucky at the end of the battle and manage to mess up your opponent right at the end, which I think already gets a lot of bonus points for me, because just thinking that this thing could just kill you in the last second makes it pretty fearsome. Moving on, there is the Disc of Force. Now the idea with Force was basically the whole thing of aligning with the actual sword contact point, which becomes a trend for all of the Excaliburs. So the idea with this is after you lose a few clicks, basically the force disc will align with the main contact point, where basically it's two ends where it's supposed to align on there. Now it's okay to use with Xcalibur if you wanted to, but really where this shines the best was on the original Valkyrie, which is Valkyrie Force Extreme. We have Valkyrie Force Extreme to show off this combo for an example. It's actually a very nice, compact, and explosive attacker. Really just gives the nice smacks that you need against that Death Scyther combo we've been trying out. It can still fail, but it does the job perfect. Of course, Valkyrie Force Extreme could be later replaced with discs like Triple and Magnum, since they accomplish the same purpose. Its contact points are pushed to two main points and has a general square shape. The weight on it was just about okay, and obviously it died off during later releases of the single/dual layer releases. Now here's where we get to the wonderful highlight of Xcalibur, which is Extreme. Now to basically talk about Extreme, this was your first rubber attack driver. Now objectively, this is the most viable attack driver in all of Burst. There are maybe specific combos where it's not best to use it with Extreme, but it's just so good. Now due to its high friction, because of the rubber, it is very aggressive. Obviously will have less stamina than, let's say, your average plastic attack driver. Obviously the flaw is that because it's rubber, it will wear down over time. So obviously, if you are someone who is in competitive, you would have to get multiple copies because it eventually wears down. Alrighty, here's a quick Bay lesson on all the Extreme variants. Your base Extreme is just the normal one that we see. Extreme Dash is where it has a red cap and a golden spring, tighter for greater burst resistance. Then after you have Metal Extreme, where instead of a plastic cap, it is a metal cap. Typically shorter teeth won't get affected too badly, but it can damage your teeth over time. There is an updated mold where it's mold 2, where it doesn't damage your teeth as easily, but also has worse resistance and slides easier and is like as bad as a normal driver for burst resistance, if not worse. With Extreme, it does vary on the rubber hardness. So between soft and hard rubber, what you need to understand is that soft rubber, the softer something is for a rubber attack driver, the easier it is to grip, but also the easier it is to wear. If the rubber is really hard, the easier is it for not to grip on the stadium and skip the ridge, potentially self-KO, but also technically also longevity. You generally want a middle ground with the extremes. So for an example, I think the Shadow Materials Purple Extreme is a good balance between like soft and hard and does the job very well. It lasted the entirety of Burst, so obviously it was very good and very meta relevant. And I really want to stress this with like DB/BU bays, but You cannot use plastic attack drivers in this layer system. Once you get to that point, for really competitive and viable, they aren't as effective as they once were. Because these bays are really, really heavy, they need high speed and friction in order to do anything with their power and to actually be effective. For the original Excalibur, it came with a yellow string launcher. This string launcher was okay for its time. It was a nice little addition that they had to it, and nothing really else to say. Released July 2nd, 2016, Xeno Excalibur Magnum Impact was released. 9.48, 9.57, 19.15, 6.03, 34.66. With Xeno Excalibur, the teeth are just okay. Now, generally, it's like an okay alternative to the single layer Excalibur, but in my opinion, other than it, like, you can say it looks cooler, but it's kind of worse in every possible regard. It's like the sword in it is not as sharp as X1 and is wider, creating a curse with Excaliburs for kind of either a rounded sword or not as sharp as it should be. Now, there was an issue on like the back of it where there was not reinforced, and in later random booster variants and mold releases that were updated, it had basically support on the hilt of the sword there. So TT does actually care, and they did actually update it. So another thing to obviously mention as well is that in general with Excaliburs, but since the things get heavier and your main contact point is plastic, eventually it will wear down over time and it becomes worse of an issue as you progress. So with Xeno Excalibur Knuckle Extreme, similar to the original Excalibur single layer combination, this one just suffers in every possible way. It is quite literally just a worse X1. More likely just to lose the matches. And some of the examples you're going to see here, the amount of times this thing has broken pattern and then after forced it to basically just do really stupid stuff at the end is very unfortunate because it is a fault of the design. Like, it's like okay to use and it was fine to use, but stuff like this gets so frustrating that they managed to fumble what was already really good. Also a bit similar on Xeno Excalibur Spread Orbit versus Death Scyther Heavy Defense. Yeah, unlike the previous X1, it doesn't have the same usefulness. I will say that there were some uses for it, but I feel like in every possible way it just feels like this very awkward downgrade. It can work more or less similar to setups as the single layer Excalibur, and I want to say it died off when Beyblade Burst God happened, but it also wasn't like too relevant even when it released. It's not that special. Now, Magnum's gimmick is similar to Force, where the idea it's supposed to basically align with Xeno to have boosted attack power for one big hit. So it's best used on three-sided releases like Victory, Valkyrie, or single layer Valkyrie. It basically had more or less the same use as triple. It was fine to use, and it died off during Beyblade Burst God, but was still meta relevant. Yeah, so basically with Victory Valkyrie Magnum Extreme, what works here is very much just the synergy. What that basically means is that since it is aligning with the wings, it allows it to actually pair up nicely and align so that way the attack power is very solid, which is probably the best use they could probably get out of the disc. I mean, yes, triple does more or less get the same use, but you know, back in the day, it at least was useful in that regard, even if it was a little bit niche. But I consider it decent in that regard, even if it is a limited application. It still isn't too bad for what it could be used for. Impact is probably one of the dumbest drivers they ever did, and arguably one of the worst attack drivers. Basically, 3 sections of it are plastic and 3 sections of it are rubber. It's like a driver that basically hates itself because it will constantly accelerate and slow down at the same time. You can't have proper control for a flower pattern. It is worse than extreme. It was so stupid of a release. It wasn't matter relevant. I actually, this is not even like exaggerating, like hyperbole. I actually just despise this driver so much. It's such a stupid, like, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? Going over our first launcher, we have the original sword launcher. Now, obviously, they did release a recolor where it was blue. This sword launcher had 2 different abilities on here. Now, depending on which mode you use on the launcher, it would either be a shorter count or a stronger, longer count. So basically what a count is when you just count how many rotations the launcher actually has. Now, if you want with this, where the X is facing on the top here, you're going to get a stronger shoot, which the count of this is about 6. Now, depending where the teeth of the ripcord go, you can either have a more controlled shoot because there's not that many teeth, or a stronger shoot. Now, the best mode was the stronger shoot. The control thing was just like a silly, stupid gimmick. The launcher is good for its time and it was sick. It was sick. You're launching with the sword, okay? Released September 15th, 2017, along with the digital sword launcher, Sieg Xcalibur 1 Iron was released. 15.8, 21.18, 6.75, 43.74. With Sieg Xcalibur, this is where it gets interesting because now Xcalibur has metal weighting on its sword. So it has metal weight, but still has obviously a sharp plastic contact. This is obviously a big W since Xeno did not. It has great KO and burst attack and strong teeth. Obviously the design is imbalanced because obviously with the metal placement and how it's going to move, it's going to be a little bit shaky. And like I mentioned, obviously the sword can wear down over time, an issue that all Excalibur's face. Was used a lot during Beyblade Briscata as a very dominant attacker. You could even argue that it could go up against things like Nightmare, which were also very dominant. It was overall very, very solid. It only died off in like Chizetsu, and used on discs either like 0, 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, or either Meteor, Vortex, Cross, Glaive, on Extreme, Atomic Destroy for an aggressive combination. Now let's see Xcalibur on like 7 bump atomic against Deep Chaos for Glaive Orbit. Now this is where it's supposed to work in the same way as X1, where either you can KO it or potentially outspin it. It does depend on your opposition. I think this was more just like a neat thing. I didn't take it too seriously, just like, oh, well, it's possible to use it on this. But yeah, it was used for that for its time. On 7 bump Extreme, for an example, on a better setup on this, yeah, very aggressive. You should be bursting stuff for KOing it. You could potentially lose your pattern and mess up, but it will kill. Once you add a metal God chip to replace that plastic one, you get the added weight that you need to help with a little bit more power to your attack. And yeah, the only times that might screw up is if it could like self-destruct either by big impact and the Bey not dying, or, you know, it just fails. But more or less, you will be just killing stuff, and it was a very much a top contender for attack, man. It did good. It did good. This is like Excalibur basically getting revived again. Dream Fafnir, 8 Glaive Atomic, dude. Left and right, Fafnir goes away. Even if you would weak launch Fafnirs to hopefully be able to tank it a little bit more, since opposite spin, you know, left versus right, it could still pretty much do the job. So overall, this was a consistent, hard-hitting, decent right spin attack type Beyblade. It does the job that it needs to. Now, one's primary use was really just specifically on Sieg Xcalibur, and that's okay. Now, obviously, like all the discs for Excalibur, basically, the idea was after you use clicks, it aligns with Sieg's contact point. It was meant to increase the attack power as advertised. You could add other frames to help it increase its stamina or life after death at the end of battles to outlast at the end. It had okay weight and did fine. It didn't last really because you had discs like 7, which 7 was already like really, really good. And obviously later discs like 0, it's like, okay, 1's really not in a good place at all for when it released. Also, an interesting thing is that basically it's hollowed on one side where it's weighed on the other side. So basically the idea is that the weight distribution is all to that one point, so it's kind of focused there. You could use it on Excalibur if you want to, but it was just really in a bad place for its time. So now with the iron driver, it was a metal flat tip. It had good speed and attack power. It was good for mobile stamina, and it was a decent attack tip and had stamina use. It could lose flower pattern a bit easily, and they obviously did have an issue of self-KO. Weak spring, as I already mentioned, was a big issue, but that's why you could use it specifically on stuff like Twin Nemesis on 0, 2, 4, 5, 7, Glaive, or Cross. Since Nemesis had strong teeth to compensate for the weak spring, it could basically work, and it was a very solid pairing. So against some random stuff in God, the idea is you're basically supposed to KO it, and this is like the only thing that could have really worked with Iron at the time in Beyblade vs. God, so it's either you die because you either stalled down, you couldn't make the hit, or you manage to stay long enough and you can give that big hit at the end to win. Okay, potentially lose to other tips that are basically faster than it, so if you're faster than Iron, you could potentially just KO it. On the launcher, the idea was once you do a shoot, it would measure your launch strength in power. This, of course, was the whole idea, also connecting this to your Bey logger, Super Bey logger, because at the time when they actually had the Bey cloud, you know, it would measure a lot of that information that you could actually go look at after. Yeah, but to mention the launcher this time around was dual spin, because obviously they're more left and right Beys. Your launcher count was about 7-ish, and And yeah, they suffer a lot of breakage issues because of its design. It was kind of common. Thank God I didn't run into it. But yeah, it was okay first time and it offered like decent amount of spin, but it did have some issues. Released on August 11th, 2018. Buster Xcalibur 1- sword was released along with the Chozetsu triple booster where you could upgrade it with dagger frame. 19.53, 22.3, 9.12, 2.57, 9.13, 53.53. Now Buster is a very strange case because I think Buster gets a little bit overhated, just a little bit. I don't think it's as good as some of the really top attackers, but it's not that bad. Now it has 2 modes. Now this is where it becomes at the fault of TAKARA TOMY's design, because before I even mentioned the sword contact point, okay, there's the normal mode and the Buster mode. So the normal mode, the sword stays in, and in Buster mode, the sword extends out, so then after you can potentially help with giving smacks for KO and bursting stuff. But the real issue with this is that since how they poorly designed it, it could, if you basically hard launch it in normal, it just goes straight into Buster mode. So essentially the entire time it's in Buster mode. Now, the issue with Buster's design as well is that the sword is not as sharp and it is rounded. The combos used during this section: Buster Xcalibur 1- dagger extreme dash, revive Hell Archer, okay, revive Phoenix, Hell Salamander, Archer Hercules, all of them on 10 proof extend plus. Yeah, so because of how the sword and the gimmick kind of screws with it, sometimes it can kind of mess up and break patterns. Also, sometimes on high impact you might die. But generally this is just a more inconsistent winning Valkyrie, but it's still pretty decent once you get it to work. I like it quite a bit. I think you can do the right amount of damage if optimized right. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a lot better than the rep it's been given, and I will say I do respect it a lot more after doing this video and testings. So with 1-, just like the previous Excalibur discs, the whole point was to align with Excalibur on its main contact point. It was, I guess, better than 1 because it had a more balanced design to it and a little bit more stamina. It was fine for what it could be used for. However, discs like 7 or 0 just simply outclassed it in purpose, and later discs like 00. Dagger is kind of sad. It's light. It's even when paired with Excalibur, it's not that useful. Now, it does have some life after death, and you could use it if you just don't own Cross. And the best combination to use dagger with is Hazard Kerbeus 7 Dagger Extreme Dash. This combo is very underrated because it was mainly discovered in the Asia regions, but works super well because of the alignment with the dagger frame and how well it pairs up with its shape. With Hazard Kerbeus, its biggest flaw is that it is an early attacker. It does not benefit from the battle being prolonged on any possible victory. Really, you need to hope you get to hit at the start, otherwise you will be doomed, but it is pretty effective. But you can debate whether or not how reliable it is by your matches. I think it's decent, not crazy consistent, but cool. Sword is just kind of a cool idea because its general design was like an actual sword, but what they basically did is that they have the iron shape of a circle and they made it jaggy. While it can make it a little bit more aggressive, it makes it far worse for controllability. It's not stable at all. While it does have a little bit of height to it, it has nothing really that effective on it. It's got low stamina and very inconsistent. July 16th, 2022, Zyphoid Excalibur Xanthus Sword Dash 1 was released. 10.69 nice, 13, 13.13, 32.48, 9.39, 78.67. So after so many years of no Excalibur, we got it. We have our Zyphoid blade right here. Its general shape is that of similar to Sieg and Buster. It does take from all the Excaliburs in one way or another. It does have a very good square shape. Your main contact point is this sharp sword contact. Generally, I would say it is filled pretty nice, but this is what is going to primarily be your use in battles, where it does feature, again, burst and KO attack properties. Now, I did have to use multiple copies because there's a very important thing to mention that we've been leading up to. It does does wear down over time due to the opposition. This is what is known as worn void, as the main contact point gets worn down from hard hits and impact, and can eventually get to the extreme point. Unfortunately, this is inevitable with Zyphoid, so you do want to have multiple copies if you are paranoid because of that. But despite the fact that it does wear down and kind of hurt the main contact point that it needs, there are ways to optimize this and make it much more effective. As through application with the Xcalibur core, we're going to be able to see how much this can help improve a Zyphoid, and why you desperately need the Xcalibur core if you want it to be effective and consistent. So with initial testings on Zyphoid, it's pretty much going to be your best friend of a right spin attack. Fresh, it will annihilate Dynamite F, either bursting it or KOing it. Combos we're going to be using on this one is going to be Zyphoid Xcalibur with 1 Spread Dash Metal Extreme, Vanish Spriggan 9, and Wind Spriggan also sharing the same parts, 9, Illegal Bearing Drift. So in a combination where it's not exactly crit void but still pretty optimal, this is kind of equivalent to that Guilty Fortress Extreme combination. The shapes pair up really nicely for it to be able to fling bays. Yes, it can still struggle against things like Vanish, but even when there's a meta with BDR where it's very defensive and kind of tanky, it still does manage to do God's work and just annihilate bays. So never be afraid to use Zyphoid, except if you're in a DB stadium. That's pretty valid. That stadium is an absolute goddamn curse to anything that is an attack type. You will not have a pleasant time at all. It does not work in the DB stadium. Like, unlike Guilty, which was pretty heavy, which Guilty would make sense, I think it fails miserably. Like, even if you got this on a plastic attack driver and tried in the DB stadium, you get humiliated, basically. So yeah, just in the standard, not in DB, where it could be useful. Please keep that in mind, please. Oh god. Now to go over the Xcalibur core, it is a very interesting core because essentially how this works is that, first of all, the teeth on it are kind of average, but that is on purpose for the gimmick to work. Essentially, after you lose a few clicks, the mini sword will come out. This works for Zyphoid because it has weighted impact once you lose those clicks, and makes it very effective for any combination used with Zyphoid. It benefits the most from that. The next part before we get into it is that it has a BU lock. Now what a BU lock basically is that it has little plastic tabs on the core that's supposed to interact with discs that are Moon and Xanthus. They have little metal tabs that when they interact with the plastic ones, supposed to have better burst resistance on it. Now you can either have combos that focus around this idea, or you can have combos that do not rely on that, which, if you don't want to rely on that, that's what the Spread Dash combo is, for an example. If you want to see ones where they focus on that, that's what we're going to get into. Now, in a combo thought up, I think, for the WBO, basically what you have to do is do Zyphoid. Also to add, you can either use the normal Extreme or a Mold 2 Metal Extreme where the tabs aren't as exposed. Zyphoid Xcalibur with the 1 armor and either have Moon or Xanthus. Now Moon is preferred because it scrapes a little bit less, but on a basic Extreme driver that is not Dash. Now while you might think, well, why is that? It's essentially utilizing the BU lock to where it won't burst right away, and you're kind of utilizing the whole gimmick for it to actually work. Now, this can be effective. Your risk is essentially that you might burst, die, and explode, but it can work. Otherwise, you can just use the previous combo where if the teeth are just a little bit worn, you more or less can kind of get similar to utilizing the BU lock. This one I view as kind of for fun, but still kind of valid competitive, but the other one is more guaranteed, which I prefer personally, which is the Spread Dash combination. Next up is Xanthus. Now this is really just for only Xcalibur. Now its issue is that it scrapes a lot because of how thick it is. And it's not too reliable, but it's decent enough. And disc priority would be, I would lean towards maybe like Moon over Xanthus, but you could argue Xanthus for the shape. And Xanthus, you could argue, has a lot more use once your Xcalibur gets worn down because it aligns with that contact point on there. So because instead of picking a good driver, they had to pick Sword Trash. Yeah, okay, Sword Dash is terrible. Same issues as before. No use at all. It is trash and garbage. Low stamina. You have no benefit of using this garbage driver. Now your 1 armor is basically the same as the namesake. It's focused on one specific area. It's only good on Zyphoid. It does it okay. The only issue is that in low mode, it's not exactly pointed to the right area. In high mode, it is. Very silly, but it still does its purpose, so it is what it is, right? Now for your sword launcher, you have your gear unit, which is power, which basically is like the best one because it allows for better rotation count, which still overall is 7 for this one in specific. Also, just to mention, dual spin, obviously a positive. Your core unit allows for a ripcord to be launched, which is cool. To try to do the whole nostalgia of the sword thing, but the ripcord is not long enough for it to matter. Your spin unit is generic. I should mention that you do need the bearing unit if you don't want to get any weird kind of skipping stuff. They try to put like a little clutch in it to try to avoid breakage issues. Unfortunately, the launcher, it's not bad, it's not really good, it's just kind of neat. That's about it. Doesn't really, it's more like, hey, that's pretty cool. But just to mention, because basically any DB launcher basic outclasses it for use, but it was more just like, hey, that's pretty cool than anything else. Yeah, but aside from that, that's basically all you need to know on Xcalibur. I have to say that it was a bumpy road. You had it where it was good, no, good, no, good. I feel ending off with Xiphoid is just, it's so amazing because of the fact that with Xiphoid, it retains the best elements from Xcalibur all into one release. And honestly, I think that's really good. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff I could have mentioned. Now, the reason why I mostly just focused on the sword contact point when describing their shape is mostly because that's the main focus for most of them. I do know that there are differences in like how basically bulky and square some of them are. So for an example, Sieg and Xiphoid. And obviously I know that Xeno, or actually, well, there's Sieg, Xiphoid, and Buster. I know kind of like for that more square shape. And I know that's like the single layer and Xeno. I'm mostly focused on the sword because that's like the main thing that kind of matters when talking about them. But aside from that, that's pretty much it. I love this bay. So I want to give credit where credit's due here at the end. I want to credit Think from WBO for combo advice, as well as Keo from the WBO for help and assistance, along with Magic and Yito from the WBO for also assistance in creating this episode. Obviously, I cannot take sole credit on this. These videos are meant for the community and also just to educate anyone who's new on Beyblade and just wants to, you know, hear about Beyblade lore and stuff. For the future, I will do my best to cover Beyblades and I will just keep on going. Also, make sure to check out our store, which is an optional way to support the channel. This is basically, it's either this or you do channel membership. It's basically what keeps me funded, so I appreciate anything. Anyways, thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day and bye!